Hello, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Santos. I'm a staff attorney at the National Law Center on Homelessness and Poverty, and I just wanted to welcome everyone on this webinar on engaging legal advocates in ESSA implementation. So we have a lot of ground to cover today, but a few housekeeping rules. I just wanted to note that today's presentation is being recorded and will be circulated shortly after the webinar. All our audience is on listen-only mode, so if you have any questions, you can submit your text questions and comments using the questions panel. You can also raise your hand and we can unmute you for verbal questions. So today we're going to cover at least two federal laws, and that's the Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015, also known as ESSA, and McKinney-Vento. And we'll go through them briefly to make sure that we're all on the same page, because I understand that not all of you are familiar with these laws. So the Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015, which reauthorized and amended McKinney-Vento, provides plenty of opportunities for legal advocates to engage with policymakers in their states. ESSA provides states with more flexibility in determining how they want to educate their students. So our webinar today is very timely because we will hear from different legal advocates in Maryland, Washington, Pennsylvania, and Illinois who have advocated for the education rights of homeless students. Speakers will identify key priorities in their respective states and will also share their experiences working with other stakeholders who are working with homeless children and youth. They will also share advocacy strategies that you could consider adopting in your state and best practices and recommendations for how to make a positive impact on the education of homeless children and youth. We have a lot to cover today, but this is just the start of the conversation. In the next few months, we will continue a series of webinars aimed at highlighting issues concerning the education of homeless children and youth. We will be looking into access to extracurricular activities, issues around unaccompanied homeless youth, and criminalization and school discipline. So today, this is just an outline of what we'll go through in the next hour and a half. So we'll have some background information to make sure everyone's on the same page. We'll talk about some of the current challenges with McKinney-Vento and ESSA. And then you'll hear from the legal advocate. So the first legal advocate we have is from Columbia Legal Services in Washington State. The second will be from Chicago Coalition for the Homeless in Illinois, followed by Public Justice Center in Maryland. And last but not least, Education Law Center in Pennsylvania. And then hopefully at the end, we'll have some time for Q&A. And on that note, we have several speakers today. So if you have a question for a specific speaker, please let us know. Otherwise, we'll just throw the question to the group. So before we move on to the next couple of slides, I just want to ask the group a question. So you'll see a question pop up on your screen. So if you can go ahead and fill that out, we'll give you a few seconds to do so, and we'll share the results before we move on. So the question is, what is your affiliation? Are you with a legal organization? So if you're an attorney or a legal advocate, pick that. If you're working for a state educational agency or for a state, for the state, pick the second option. You can also choose the local educational agency. So if you're working for a school district or a school, or if you're just another advocate or provider working with homeless children and youth, that's the fourth option. And last is if you don't fit any of the other options provided. So I'll give you a few more seconds to fill out this poll, and then I'll go ahead and close it. Okay, so 16% of you are from a legal organization, 14% are working with a state educational agency. A huge chunk of you guys are from local educational agencies, so school districts. Others are 12% are advocates and other providers, and 16% do not fit any of the other categories. Okay, so let's move on to some background information. I'm going to talk about McKinney-Vento. So McKinney-Vento, in a nutshell, functions as an exception to this rule that you can only attend a school in the same district that you're residing. So the law says that if you're experiencing homelessness and you're temporarily living outside of that school district, that you're able to attend that same school of origin, and you're entitled to receive transportation to and from that school of origin. This was passed in 1987, so it's been around. And McKinney-Vento Homeless Assistance Act is actually a huge bill. It's a large bill. But for today's webinar, we'll only be talking about the Education for Homeless Children and Youth program. It was recently amended and reauthorized by the Every Student Succeeds Act of 2015, and the amendments took effect on October 1st, 2016. Now, ESSA made a lot of improvements on McKinney-Vento. It improved identification of homeless students, improved provision of services to homeless children and youth, clarified the rights of unaccompanied homeless youth, also increased the transparency and public involvement, increased funding and capacity as well. But for the purposes of today's conversation, I want to focus on this ongoing affirmative obligation to review and revise barriers to the identification, enrollment, attendance, and success in school of homeless children and youth. As many of you know, homelessness disproportionately affects vulnerable populations. Many of homeless children and youth identify as unaccompanied, identify as LGBTQ. Homelessness also disproportionately affects students with disabilities, immigrants and students of color. A lot of homeless students have also come into contact with the foster care system, and many have experienced domestic violence and trauma. So the point I'm trying to make here is that collaboration between different agencies and between different providers is key to making sure that we meet the educational needs of homeless children and youth. Now, there's a lot of information around McKinney-Vento and ESSA that I'm not going to go through in today's webinar, but I do want to highlight our resource called No Barriers, a Legal Advocate's Guide to Ensuring Compliance with the Education Program of the McKinney-Vento Act. It's available online and it's free, so I suggest you download it and check it out when you get a chance. Now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague to talk about some of the challenges that we've encountered around McKinney-Vento and ESSA.
Hi, I'm Ruthelle. I am a legal intern here at the Law Center. And again, I'd like to remind everyone that all the resources from the Law Center are downloadable. And as Michael stated, heightened legal requirements went into effect fall of 2016. Many states already struggle to make schools accessible to homeless students, and the lack of adequate funding and resources places a strain on liaisons, coordinators, and other school personnel working with homeless students. We conducted a national survey of current state laws, policies, and regulations to show the common areas where states need to be aggressive with efforts, allowing them to be in full compliance with federal law, including the amendments to the McKinney-Vento Act that went into effect on October 1st, 2016. In the report, we recommend that the focus be placed on identifying homeless children and youth and ensure that they can enroll in, attend, and succeed in schools as guaranteed by McKinney-Vento. Some noteworthy trends that were identified in our report are that there are already over 1.36 million homeless children and youth attending U.S. public schools, and the number has steadily increased over the years and nearly doubled since 2007. Additionally, the number is unlikely to decrease as schools become better at identifying homeless students and as more students become aware of the law. Although under-identification of homeless students continues to be a challenge for many state educational agencies and local education agencies. It should also be noted that there is a difficulty monitoring McKinney-Vento compliance. Most states do not have a formal, comprehensive monitoring reporting process for evaluating McKinney-Vento compliance, and most reports were not readily available online. That leads us to the next slide discussing the issues identified in the report. Beginning with funding, since the allocated federal funding is not sufficient to meet the educational needs of homeless children and youth, we recommend that there be adequate federal funding of McKinney-Vento so children and youth, so state education agencies and school districts can effectively address the needs of homeless children and youth. States and localities must also provide supplemental funding for programs related to education of homeless children and youth, and that funding should be based on the number and needs of the identified students. The next issue identified is staffing and capacity. States and school districts are unable to fully comply with McKinney-Vento if they lack sufficient staffing or if staff have not been adequately trained. We recommend that the states and local school districts hire sufficient numbers of state coordinators and liaisons, and that these staff must have sufficient capacity and training to fulfill all obligations. As is the case with funding, fulfilling this requirement is likely to lead to higher levels of compliance across the board. Our next issue is technical assistance and monitoring. States and school districts do not provide enough technical assistance and training, and they lack effective monitoring to ensure accountability. Data collection varies but is generally insufficient in quality and quantity to allow for meaningful monitoring. We recommend that states develop comprehensive monitoring and reporting plans to ensure adequate oversight of the McKinney-Vento program. Standardize a universal data collection and evaluation system for use by school districts to identify and track local activities and services implemented through McKinney-Vento, and establish mandatory reporting requirements and deadlines for reporting on implementation and compliance at least every 2 years. Next, discipline and criminalization homeless student issues. Laws or rules that criminalize or punish homelessness, like the quality of life ordinances, status offenses, and school discipline, can be barriers that prevent students equal access to schooling. We recommend that states and local agencies to review and change school discipline policies to ensure that no student is punished because of their housing status. Additionally, states and local agencies need to coordinate with policymakers and other state and local stakeholders to ensure that there are no laws criminalizing homelessness that impede access to school for homeless children and youth. Moving on to dispute resolution issues. Dispute resolution procedures vary across state and school district lines, creating barriers for highly mobile homeless students. These policies lack procedural safeguards to ensure that they're fair, adequate, and reliable. The Law Center recommends that dispute resolution procedures required of states and local districts be impartial, but also accessible to homeless students and their families. If you're interested in this topic, please check out this resource and get in touch with us. Credit accrual issues. For highly mobile homeless students who are forced to switch schools, have trouble obtaining credit for work they've done while attending a previous school, particularly when they've moved mid-semester. In many cases, switching schools can set back a homeless student because of different schools may have different graduation requirements. ESSA now requires barriers that prevent receiving appropriate credit for full or partial coursework satisfactorily completed at a prior school be identified and removed. We recommend states and local districts create credit accrual policies for homeless children and youth who have changed schools and supports and services to ensure that they graduate from high school. Next, access to early childhood education. The high need of children experiencing homelessness to access early childhood education is rarely matched with sufficient services. McKinney-Vento extends the right of access to publicly provided schooling to homeless preschool children, and ESSA guarantees school of origin enrollment and transportation rights to homeless preschoolers in preschool programs. That being said, we recommend that states adopt early childhood education programs and policies that take into account the needs of homeless children and families, and include procedures for coordinating services across governmental agencies, such as early child education, nutrition and health, mental health and addiction, housing services, and social services. Next, privacy issues, finally. Some local education agencies, policies, and practices verify residency and McKinney-Vento eligibility do not comport with the federal law's requirements to protect homeless students' privacy, and in doing so, increase housing instability for families trying to get back on their feet. ESSA clarifies that a homeless student's living situation is part of the student's education record and is protected by federal privacy laws. We recommend that residency verification policies and other related procedures must be reviewed and revised to ensure they accommodate the unique needs of homeless students and/or their families. This is to ensure they do not erect barriers to identify or immediate or of immediate enrollment of homeless students, and to ensure homeless students are not stigmatized and that their privacy rights are respected. Now, I know I just provided you with a lot of information, but all this is available online, and please check out for more details. Now I'll return it back to Michael.
Thanks, Ruth. Okay, so before we move on to the meat of our webinar today, I just want to have a few more things to talk about. So the Law Center is an ally and would like to support your efforts to comply and enforce the law. As you coordinate and collaborate with other agencies and providers, think about the importance of legal advocates. Many homeless children and youth and their families have legal issues that go beyond just access to education. So thinking about issues around domestic violence, eviction, disability rights. Schools provide opportunity to receive important supports and services for many homeless children and youth. And legal advocates want what's best for the homeless child or youth and their families. So legal advocates like the Law Center can help expand your capacity to fulfill your duties and responsibilities under the law. And legal advocates can provide you with added authority and strength in enforcing the federal law. So Project Learn, also known as Lawyers Education Access Resource Network, which is run by the Law Center, is a peer-to-peer network of legal advocates across the country working on McKinney-Vento access to education issues. The collective goals of the group is to develop enforcement and implementation strategies, provide technical assistance and or legal representation to those who need them, and more importantly, do policy advocacy on the federal and state levels. In states like Massachusetts, Washington, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Illinois, legal advocates have pushed for legislative changes to support the work of states and school district liaisons and to strengthen the education rights of homeless children and youth. Many states have gone above McKinney-Vento requirements. McKinney-Vento, as many of you know, is a federal law and is seen as a 4-4 requirements. States can go above and beyond, and having legal advocates can help you achieve some of your goals through policy advocacy. Another thing I want to bring up is that the American Bar Association has committed funds to support the development and implementation of a national homeless youth legal network. It's a new initiative aimed at increasing legal services for youth and young adults experiencing homelessness by fostering greater capacity and connectivity. As a catalyst and convener to address the legal issues of homeless youth and improve outcomes for those transitioning from the child welfare system and exiting the juvenile justice system through direct representation, the ABA, American Bar Association, invites federal partners and national, state, and local organizations to join the effort to develop the Homeless Youth Legal Network. So if any of these networks interest you, please get in touch with us. Again, the slides will be made available after the webinar. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Sujata Branch from Columbia Legal Services. Sujata, take it away.
Thank you, Michael. I'll be talking about homeless education advocacy in Washington State, kind of building on what Michael and his colleague have already shared. Next slide. I'm Sujata Jagdish Branch. I'm the directing attorney of the Children and Youth Project at Columbia Legal Services, and I'll be covering generally 3 topics today. The work that we've done investigating and communicating about homelessness among students, successful legislative advocacy, and our Schoolhouse Washington partnership. I love this picture, and I included it because you can see that it's a celebration. Katara Jordan, who used to be a member of my team and now is at Building Changes, Hillary Madsen, and Brandy Sincere. And also because I'm pretty new to Columbia Legal Services and I really want to give credit where credit is due. There's been some amazing work done by Columbia Legal Services and other organizations through the years. So the next few slides are about investigation and communication that we've done. Years ago, we started finding out more about what's actually happening among students and who experiences homelessness where they are, because that kind of information informs the advocacy that we want to do. You may be scratching your head about this slide and why I included something from so long ago, and there is a reason. So this slide is from 2006 through 2009, and what it shows is really dramatic increases in identification of students experiencing homelessness. that's partly because, unfortunately, just through the years, as housing has gotten more expensive and there have been other changes, there are more students experiencing homelessness. And it's also, at least temporarily, related to the fact that around these years we were doing public disclosure acts under state law to ask school districts for information about their identification of students experiencing homelessness. And lo and behold, we started seeing that the numbers of the students they were identifying were increasing as we were asking the questions. Next slide. More about communicating about the problem. I love to write 20, 50, 100-page reports about issues and explore all the details and ins and outs. But to get the word out to the widest possible audience, we see the really tremendous importance of having concise, easy to read, beautifully put together color one-pagers on the issues. And we've created a lot of one-pagers like this one, Student Homelessness in Washington State, What We Know. I mentioned that we've done Public Disclosure Act requests and gathered information. One of the key pieces of information we received in Washington is that there are homeless liaisons, and they spend the vast majority of their time on other duties, and they have a chance to spend only a couple of hours each week on their liaison duties. You'll hear more about that in a few minutes. Next slide, please. Okay, so this is also about communication. I love this picture because it's a quintessential Washington picture with the community in the foreground and the beautiful Washington pine trees in the background, the snow-capped mountains in the way back. And it paints a stark picture about what's happening in this particular community in Shelton. Really high rates of poverty, and about 10.1% of all students experience homelessness. So this is an example of something that we created to get the word out about an important issue and something that's going on locally that affects everybody in Washington. Next slide, please. Another piece of communication, as we did our investigation, we discovered something really important that many legislators took notice of and cared a lot about when we shared the information. Only 23 out of the 296 school districts in Washington received federal funding. This was back in 2012, 2013. And we have the map that really lays out in clear terms, here are the only places that received the funding. And of course, we were getting questions from people who were serving students experiencing homelessness elsewhere and not getting any funding. The chart lays out in short form. I know it's a little hard to see on the slide, but the districts that received funding, how much they received, and how many students they had who experienced homelessness. Next slide, please. So you might have been wondering, why did I share all that information about the communication? And one reason is that it led to some important advocacy. This is the first of two bills that I'll be telling you about. We worked on the Homeless Children Education Act, HB 2373. You've heard about some of the information that we received, and we felt like it was important for both the community at large and schools to have more information in order to make the best decisions about policy. So this law requires biannual legislative reports on the status of homeless students, an annual report to the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction, which we call OSPI, and it has to include dropout rates for grades 7 through 12. In Washington and in a lot of states, one of the things that really concerns advocates is really tremendous dropout rates for students and low rates of graduation for students experiencing homelessness. Also, best practices handouts on how to choose a homeless liaison, and a great video for training on the state agency's website. This kind of relates to what Michael and his colleague were saying. Well-meaning school districts who really want to do the right thing, it's important for them to have information from the state about what they could be doing to do a good job to serve these students. Next slide, please. I love this picture too. So this is a picture of Governor Inslee signing the legislation and circled are Brandy Sincere and Katara Jordan, who were able to be present during that signing ceremony. Next slide, please. So getting back to the data messaging, that legislation was a tremendous victory, and there was and still is a lot more to be done. We've found that data messaging is a really important way of getting the word out there. This is a pretty simple, easy to create chart. You can do it through Excel or other programs, and it lays out students identified as experiencing homelessness over the years. So these are years that we've been doing this advocacy. You can see really clear, stark terms, the increases in the rates, and those numbers have continued to go up after 2014, 2015. And we just received the most recent data from the state agency. I'm ready for the next one. Thanks, Michael. Also communicating about the problem. There are so many stereotypes and so many assumptions that people often make about students experiencing homelessness. This lays out the age ranges. It's not exclusively little kids. It's not exclusively high school kids. About 50% of the students in the state 50% of the students experiencing homelessness in the state are in elementary school, and a high percent are in the other grades too. So it's really spread across the age spectrum. Next slide, please. Michael? Okay. So just a brief word about this. I love Twitter, and Columbia Legal Services was an early adopter of Twitter. And one of the things I love about it is retweeting and getting the word out beyond the communities we usually communicate with. So what this says is, if our beloved local sports team, the Seattle Seahawks, were Washington students, then 5 players would be homeless. Next slide, please. We've also gotten a lot of publicity, both through our efforts and through efforts of other organizations. The first headline you see, legislature has a choice to not leave homeless students behind. Are there more homeless students in Washington than previously thought? That relates to the communication I mentioned earlier in the charts that I was discussing. And the last headline. Research, 1 in 34 students homeless in Washington, and now the number is even higher, 1 in 27.
And that gives you a little, you can change the size.
Slide, please. So this is a powerful picture, the little kid in a group, and 35,511 students experiencing homelessness, which was the number a year ago. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we get back to the substance, and I teased you a little bit earlier with the picture of colleagues celebrating, and now I'm going to tell you what they were celebrating. This was a ceremony at McCarver Elementary School for the signing of the Homeless Student Stability Act. Those are Katara and Hillary and Brandy celebrating outside, and there's a picture of Governor Inslee signing and meeting with the students, and the wonderful cake. And I feel like it's really important to have these ceremonies and celebrations to commemorate the good things that happen. In Washington, the Homeless Student Stability Act has made a really big difference. It has a significant statement on homeless students, and by that I mean an aspirational goal that students should not exit public systems of care into homelessness, so like foster care or truancy proceedings or dependency proceedings, that there should be supports for them so they enter something better than homelessness afterwards. And Michael mentioned that federal funding should be increased and states should be looking at funding as well. Well, that's a success in Washington. We have grants to schools to identify and serve more homeless students, and also grants for schools to engage in housing partnerships and help students obtain housing. The legislation also requires data on unaccompanied youth and disproportionality, requires staff in middle and high schools focused on unaccompanied youth, and also allows unaccompanied youth to access preventative health care, which has been a problem in the past because parents may not be available to give consent. Next slide, please. We've worked really extensively with the state in collaborative relationships with really caring state agencies that have the same goals that we do. The Office of the Superintendent of Public Instruction, which I've mentioned earlier, the Office of Homeless Youth, which is in the Department of Commerce, and I'll say a little bit more about that later, with homeless liaisons across the state, and a former staff member was appointed to the Office of Youth Prevention and Protection Programs Advisory Committee. Next slide, please. We also have been engaging in creative collaborations for many years. There are a lot of organizations in the Western Washington, which is where Seattle is, and also across the state that are really devoted to addressing this issue. I've listed them out here. My favorite name is WACHA, the Washington Coalition for Homeless Youth Advocacy. Some do more local advocacy, some do more high-level state advocacy and coordination, like Away Home Washington. And I mentioned earlier the Department of Commerce Office of Homeless Youth. And one thing that I'm really excited about is that office last month in December issued a report with extensive recommendations about ways to mitigate the impact of homelessness, to make it as short as possible, and to work toward ending homelessness. And there's very strong support across communities to support the recommendations of that report and make the recommendations a reality. Next slide, please. Know Your Rights trainings, I've listed a few that we've done, and I particularly want to mention our Homeless Youth Handbook. That's about a 200-page publication which we've worked on for some years with Starbucks and with the law firm Baker McKenzie. And we update it regularly. It covers all the key topics that youth, their families, and organizations that provide services to them that schools might need, and it's focused on Washington State. We also have an important report, about a 15-page report called Falling Through the Gaps, that makes recommendations about best practices and ways that systems could be improved. Those are all available on our website, which is columbialegal.org. Next, please. Schoolhouse Washington. This is the first page of our Schoolhouse Washington website. Next slide, please. Schoolhouse Washington was incubated by Columbia Legal Services and now is a partnership between Building Changes and Columbia Legal Services. Next slide. So what do we do in Schoolhouse Washington? We support sustainability and expansion of the Homeless Student Services Act, which I mentioned earlier. And we support pilots to foster collaborations, because ending student homelessness involves not just schools, also community organizations, housing organizations, and we can play an important role in bridging those communities. We develop and support champions, and we also engage in advocacy and legal analysis to share information, to share promising practices, promote effective policies, and we are going to be working on a Know Your Rights toolkit as well. Next slide, please. Thank you so much to our funders for making the Schoolhouse Washington advocacy and the other work I've mentioned possible. And I have just one more slide before I turn it over. Our Twitter handle is at schoolhousewa.org. Is at schoolhousewa. The Schoolhouse Washington website is schoolhousewa.org, and we're posting new information there all the time. So thank you so much.
Okay, thank you, Sujata. Now we're moving from west to east. We're going to move to the Midwest. If for those of you on the webinar consider Chicago as Midwest. Let's hear it from Rini Hayback and Patricia Nix-Hodes from Chicago Coalition for the Homeless.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for tuning in. And it was really wonderful what Sujanta presented. I think it really shows how much can be accomplished in implementing the Act in any one of our states. First slide, please, Michael. Obviously, the focus for everyone, I think, who is in the audience is to solve problems that impede principally the success, but certainly the identification, enrollment, and attendance of our homeless students. And so it seems that an important focus for each one of us to have every year is to remove or reduce at least one or more of these barriers in our own jurisdictions. Next slide. The Chicago Coalition for the Homeless works statewide, but we work very significantly in Chicago, which is the largest school district in the state and the third largest in the country. We've had a lot of successes in our years of work, which now amounts to 20 years of working. We did the first formal homeless education policies in Chicago and the state as a result of litigation. We participated in crafting and passing our own law governing the education of homeless children and youth. We worked to achieve legal recognition that doubled up. It was homelessness. Even before the McKinney-Vento Act reflected that. We have worked on and succeeded in getting Illinois to recognize the right of homeless students to play school sports. We passed regulation which made crystal clear that school districts had to enroll both immigrant students and homeless students without requiring documentation. We've achieved dedicated state funding for homeless education programs, not as extensively as Washington, and we haven't had it in a few years, but it's still been an important victory. What we would like to suggest to people is that, oh, sorry, I've skipped a slide. We also succeeded in getting the Chicago program to change its name from Homeless Education to STLS, Students in Temporary Living Situations, a non-stigmatizing title. Also, working with the Illinois State Board of Education, we have been able to update and greatly improve our state policy and the registration enrollment guidance which outlines for school districts what they can and cannot do in enrolling students. We've achieved better utilization of Title I in Chicago, and in Chicago in particular, established very comprehensive transportation rules. We also have achieved much greater preschool access in the Chicago area, and recently we updated our policy here in Chicago. We also passed a minor consent to medical care law to solve the same problem that obviously Columbia Legal Services was trying to solve. And we too have participated in creating a homeless youth handbook for Illinois. We are suggesting to folks that as they move forward, here are the things we did. We identified a change needed. We looked for opportunities, whether they were internal or external, good or bad, to create change. Next slide, please. We took advantage of compelling incidents, change in leadership, budget hearings, proposed legislation, and board meetings to allow us to expand our message and lay the groundwork for change.
Okay, now we're switching over. This is Patricia. In our work, we also try to develop a lot of factual support for any campaign we're undertaking. Often things arise out of a specific instance that we can document, a specific story or case. We try to always include parent and student input since that's invaluable. We use data, reports, studies. Sometimes we create those studies, reports, or data to support what we're trying to do. We think about surveys. We did a survey of school liaisons a couple of years ago for one campaign, and we always value and try to get across the personal, genuine stories of students, parents, and also school staff. Next slide. And in doing all of this, we really look to the legal basis. And, you know, Michael touched on this quite a bit about removing barriers. And both the SEA and the LEA have that obligation. Next slide. Finally, we really try to look at what assets we have and who our allies might be. And we think both within the school district and outside of the school district. So this slide just lists some of the people we have collaborated with on various campaigns that we have done. And I would say, again, you know, we think it's most invaluable to have parent involvement and involvement of students who have experienced homelessness, but also all of the different roles, including the liaisons in the school district, and a lot of external service providers, legal aid organizations, legislative or other government champions. And our next slide is a picture of two members of our education committee who helped us advocate for the Chicago Public Schools homeless education policy, which I'll touch on later. And also the next slide is a bigger group of people who were involved in that campaign. So we think that there's a lot of tools that can be used and considered. Strong leaders, parents and students, you know, as I mentioned, an inside-outside strategy, thinking of who might be able to influence the change you're trying to make. And as was previously mentioned, you know, thinking about media, whether it's traditional news media or social media. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Rini to talk about one state legislative campaign we have worked on.
So we just wanted to use this as an example of how you can take a negative incident that comes from an external force and turn it into something positive. So a legislator in Illinois introduced a bill which essentially provided that if a student was homeless in another district for 12 months, then that student would no longer be considered homeless, and they would no longer be able to attend the school district as a school district of origin or get transportation. So to us, this was critical to defeat this bill. And we decided that in defeating the bill, which clearly conflicted with McKinney-Vento, which provides no time limit on, you know, how long a student can be homeless, that we would try to turn our lemons into lemonade and create greater fairness in the dispute process and reduce school mobility. So next slide, please. We identified the barrier, too many harmful school changes, and the effort to inappropriately save money on transportation. We determined that we needed to get the statute to read differently, of course, and our opportunity was the chance to make things better. Next slide. We used our factual support, which included stories by families and school staff. We used the data we had compiled about the actual cost of transportation, which was greatly exaggerated by a number of school districts who wanted this law. And of course, we pointed out that it conflicted with federal McKinney-Vento Act, which many of our legislators didn't know. And we made clear that a refusal to enroll a student generates the right to a dispute. Our allies included families, other education nonprofits, liaisons for the homeless program throughout our state, other legislators, and our state coordinator, in fact. And we crafted a narrow message, no limit on the length of homelessness, so no automatic change, and the process ought to be fair. Next slide. Immediate action was required because it was filed and beginning to move in our legislature. We created a fact sheet, we disseminated it to allies and legislators, and we used our tools, including our media tools. What did we do? We stopped automatic school changes after 12 months, and most importantly, we amended the bill to require that a determination of whether homelessness continues after 18 months is subject to the dispute process. We included a change in the statute, which actually arose in the context of our Education for Homeless Children law, that required trained and fair independent hearing officers, which we hadn't had before. We allowed for families to submit affidavits to support that they were still, for example, doubled up and hardship still existed. And we also ensured that any student who is determined to be no longer homeless in a dispute process would be able to complete the school year. So that prevented harmful disruption in the course of the year.
So for a more local example, we recently worked in conjunction with our education committee here to update the Chicago Public Schools policy for students in temporary living situations. And I would just note that this was a situation where our advocacy was initially sparked by an athletic eligibility case that a high school senior was barred from playing on his school's football team because he was a transfer student, and we viewed that as a denial of immediate enrollment under McKinney-Vento. But because the existing CPS policy didn't include any information about that, many people in the school district were reluctant to allow this student to play, although we were successful in getting him to be able to play. But the policy didn't make clear that enrollment included full participation in school activities. And it also didn't reflect the reauthorized McKinney-Vento Act, some state policies that had been enacted since the adoption of the policy, and also our State Board of Education guidance and registration on the enrollment of homeless students. And the policy was actually 20 years old, so there had been a lot of law and policy developed since then. It also did not include the McKinney definition of homeless child or youth, and it had just a lot of incorrect logistical things, like the name of the program was wrong, the name of the liaison, the actual address for CPS offices and phone numbers were incorrect. It referred to a very outdated public transportation payment system of tokens that hasn't existed for years. And the liaison for the district herself recognized that the outdated policy was a barrier because she had trouble getting compliance from principals because the policy didn't support her. So I would just go on to say initially CPS's response to our request to update the policy was that it was not necessary. They later proposed a very short 2-paragraph policy that basically referred everyone to the website for procedures. And that was something that we and our parents really objected to because we felt that it was important to have a strong written policy with public input. Our education committee got very involved. They told their stories of trying to access needed services and difficulties with it. They collaborated with our law project. They testified at numerous Chicago Public School board meetings. They attended meetings with the mayor. Michael, can you move to the next slide? And they also, when there was a proposed limit on the length of transportation, they invited someone from the mayor's office with a group of homeless families to walk the distance CPS was proposing to only provide transportation for, and that really turned things around. So after 2 years of advocacy, and next slide, please, in April 2006, an updated comprehensive policy was adopted. It included some ESSA provisions. It removed that transportation distance restriction and addressed full participation, school supplies, fee waivers, and more.
This is Rini again, and I just want to say, this is our final slide, our key priorities in implementing ESSA as we move forward include these 3 points, which actually encompass significant work. School stability, which the new change to ESSA, which provides immediate enrollment in school that is chosen by the family, is a very important provision to allow kids to immediately get into school. Also, the new definition of school of origin, which makes a preschool the school of origin and requires that when any grade level is completed, the next designated school for receiving students will become the school of origin. We are also going to work very significantly on inclusion of homeless students in all schools and programs, including selective enrollment, charter, magnet, online, and vocational programs, which our kids have historically been excluded from. And they're able to do this now under ESSA, in part because of a provision that allows the enrollment of students in schools for which they are eligible, regardless of missed application or enrollment deadlines. And finally, there is a provision now on the duty to remove barriers, including fees, fines, absenteeism, and transportation. So those will be our focuses moving forward this year. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rini and Patricia from Chicago Coalition for the Homeless. Now we're going to move further east, closer to DC in Maryland. Monisha Shirail from Public Justice Center. Monisha, go ahead.
Hello, Michael, and everyone else. Thank you so much for the opportunity to share with you today about the Public Justice Center's Education Stability Project. Now, the PJC is a legal advocacy organization. We work in a variety of areas in civil legal services with a view towards helping individuals, but also impacting systems that serve poor people here in our state of Maryland. And with respect to the issue of education, our focus really is on homeless students and students in foster care or otherwise in out-of-home care. And to assist these students, homeless students in particular, we have a range of tools in our toolkit. And what I'm going to do is just walk through each of those, what those look like, and how we use them here in Maryland. Next slide, please. First, we spend a good amount of time doing outreach and training around the needs and rights of homeless students and effective, very practical strategies for supporting them. So our goal really is to get the word out, both to homeless families and youth themselves or those who may become homeless, and to the various public and private agencies that may be serving them. So we focus our training on organizations and agencies that have a specific mission to serve homeless families, so shelters, transitional housing, healthcare for the homeless is a program we work with a lot. And with respect to the shelters and transitional housing organizations, we've formed a really deep partnership with their their education liaisons, which they're required to have under the Hearth Act, and we meet and train with them regularly. But we also try to reach out to and target a number of other organizations, recognizing that most homeless students in our state aren't in shelter. Most, over 75%, according to our latest data, are doubled up and not necessarily likely to be connected to a homeless serving agency, but they may incidentally encounter or participate in after-school programs, access their libraries, participate in employment programs, and that's why we find it really important to reach out and engage those groups as well. They're the most likely, I think, to identify and serve those homeless families who are sort of under the radar and may not even know that they have a set of rights when it comes to education. We also do training with school systems themselves and their staff, and with the Child Welfare Agency and our juvenile justice agencies, which oftentimes are seeing overlapping populations. And again, we focus in doing this outreach not just on what's required by law, but really what it means to be a homeless student, who a homeless student might be in your classroom, and best practices for serving them. Next slide. A second tool we use to ensure the protection of homeless students' rights is individual advocacy. So when we do outreach with families, with other organizations, we often end up getting referrals. You know, we get a call that someone's not been able to get their child into school, or they've been waiting 3 weeks on transportation. And we take those calls and provide assistance to folks all around the state. Most of the time, it's as simple as making sure that the homeless education liaison within a school system understands the situation, understands why this is, in fact, a homeless situation, and responds appropriately. You know, despite our training efforts and those of school systems, we find that an ongoing problem throughout the state is that sometimes frontline staff don't realize that a particular family might be homeless, or that there's a particular set of protections that kicks in if they are. So oftentimes our individual advocacy just involves communicating a problem to the homeless education liaison or their staff who are in a position to address it. We do also make use of the McKinney-Vento dispute resolution process, which in Maryland is further implemented by state regulations, kind of laying out the steps that a family must be permitted to go through if they have a dispute with a school system over whether or not they're homeless, or what documents they need, or whether they should get transportation or another service. We find that even in spite of the procedure that's set out in McKinney-Vento and in our state regulation, that there's tremendous variation across different school systems as to what the dispute resolution process looks like. So sometimes appeals are on paper only. Sometimes, you know, there's an opportunity for a meeting or a conference or a hearing of some sort. Sometimes families can, you know, bring witnesses. Sometimes they can't. And virtually all the time, families have almost no idea what to expect. It tends to be a process that is fairly underutilized, which means that sometimes school staff themselves are not always sure how it works, and families almost certainly are unfamiliar. So this is a circumstance where you know, attorneys, I think, have a critical role in ensuring that the dispute resolution process really is one that gives families a chance to tell their side of the story and be heard by someone who is in a position to be objective and impartial and make a fair decision. And you know, our role in that process is really just to help facilitate the telling of that story. I would say that, you know, with respect to that first bullet, our informal advocacy, that's an area where we, as you know, recognize that there's just not going to be attorneys who are going to be able to assist every family around the state. So we've made it a priority to empower advocates at shelters and other homeless serving organizations to play some of that same role, the informal advocacy, although they frequently consult with me if they're facing challenges. But the second piece with the dispute resolution, the McKinney-Vento appeals, while in theory the process should be family friendly, and certainly I've seen it work that way in some school systems, oftentimes it's not for the reasons I described. And one you know, practice we're encouraging our state to adopt is just to put out a list of legal services. Not that there's a large number of them, but legal services and other legal resources that can support families in the dispute resolution process. Next slide, please. Another major area of focus for us is engaging with school systems around their obligation that Michael mentioned earlier to affirmatively identify and remove barriers to homeless students' participation and success. So, you know, when we're doing our individual advocacy, we are keeping an eye out for trends and challenges. You know, are all the unaccompanied homeless youth in a particular school system facing challenges with enrollment? And when we see those types of patterns coming up again and again, to us that indicates a potential systemic barrier. And one of our missions is to work with local school systems to address those systemic barriers. And there's a number of different ways we can do that, more or less formal. You know, an example of sort of a formal process through which we help school systems to address systemic barriers is to comment on proposed regulations and policies. For example, this past summer, one of the school systems here in Maryland was revising its general policies for student enrollment and for school selection. And even though that policy sort of wasn't headlined as one relating to homelessness, it's certainly one that should take into account the rights of homeless students, for example, to enroll without the standard paperwork, and to have the opportunity under the new law in ESSA to attend magnet schools and charter schools without barriers. So we provided comments as part of that formal process, and we're pleased to see that the board did adopt a number of them. But oftentimes our collaboration can be more informal and more in-depth. So another recent example involved an effort whereby we formed a student school stability work group in partnership with the school system who wanted to address some of the systemic challenges we'd alerted them to around McKinney-Vento implementation. So we co-chaired this work group with someone from Student Services within the school system. We had NACI, the National Association for the Education of Homeless Children and Youth, working with us as a consultant, and then the work group itself included upwards of 60 members representing homeless shelters, transitional housing, our mayor's office of homeless services, a number of youth programs, staff from individual schools, as well as parents and youth themselves. And through a year-long process, we met regularly, reviewed best practices from other jurisdictions, took a look at the specific sources of the challenges we've been seeing within the particular school system we were working in, and ended up with sort of a blueprint that set forth what the problems were and what solutions the school system could pursue. So that's just one example of a very promising form of collaboration with the school system. Next slide, please. We also do a good amount of legislative advocacy in the Maryland General Assembly. So, this is a list of some of the bills we've worked on most recently. I'll sort of go backwards up the list. A couple years ago, we were able to enact an unaccompanied homeless youth tuition waiver. So this gets at issues at the higher ed level. But essentially, this legislation allows youth in Maryland to now, unaccompanied homeless youth, so those who are without stable housing and not receiving the support, not connected with a parent or legal guardian, to go to any of our public colleges and universities, community colleges, our University of Maryland system, and some other public colleges, tuition-free, and use any other grants or aid they receive towards living expenses. So this is, in many ways, for those youth who do pursue higher education, a route to both getting their degree and getting housed, at least during the school year. So it's been really valuable. Now we're in the implementation phase, and certainly it's got its challenges, but a tremendous new benefit for youth that we're very proud of. Youth Reach is legislation enacted a few years ago. One of our partner organizations, the Homeless Persons Representation Project, really was the lead on this, but it created and required that local jurisdictions in Maryland take a census of homeless youth. So similar to sort of the point-in-time count, the PIT count that many of you will be familiar with, but targeted at youth who oftentimes, at least in Maryland, were not showing up on the PIT count in any significant way because, the PIT count was just not targeted towards where youth were when they were on their own and homeless. And then that first piece of legislation on the list created a task force to study housing and supportive services for homeless youth. Again, this is a few years ago, and when the law passed, it created an interagency commission, including representation from our State Department of Ed, our State Department of Housing and Community Development, Juvenile Services, and also brought in a number of private homeless services providers and advocates, including the PJC, and required us to really look across the board at the range of issues confronting homeless children and youth and develop a set of recommendations. And that sort of feeds nicely into, if you go to the next slide, some of the statewide advocacy at the sub-legislative level we've been focused on more recently. So one of the recommendations that came out of the task force was to really revamp our state's McKinney-Vento plan, which had not been updated for a number of years, to make it a much more practical document that provided real guidance to our State Department of Ed and to our local educational agencies with regard to the issue of homeless students' education. So following the release of the task force recommendations, the PJC, my organization, has been working closely with our State Department of Ed to update that plan, and starting from a couple years ago, and then the enactment of ESSA last year really sort of aided and hastened that process because it required the State Department of Ed to really do a comprehensive review of all of its plans, including its plan under McKinney-Vento, and required a number of updates to that plan to reflect changes and expansions in the protections available under the law. So we were very pleased to see that just this past December, Maryland State Department of Ed released its comprehensive ESSA draft plan, touching on the whole range of issues that ESSA covers. And with respect to the section relating to McKinney-Vento and homeless students' education, a number of the recommendations that we've been working on with the state were reflected there. And you know, this was a process that, you know, we vetted it with LEAs, represented to LEAs at our technical assistance meeting last year. It was informed by the experiences of our clients and the partners we work with, and through all of that work, the ongoing individual advocacy, the partnership with other agencies and what we learned from them, we were able to kind of translate the state plan into now something that looks a little bit, you know, looks like a much more practical, living, breathing document that's useful, sort of on the ground, and will hopefully be a strong resource for years to come. So the process is still ongoing. We've made some additional comments to the state plan, and MSD will be updating it accordingly. But we're very pleased to see that engagement with MSD has resulted in already a much stronger set of proposals to implement McKinney-Vento statewide. We also, always taking the opportunity to weigh in on a number of regulations that have been developed at the state level to implement the law. Some years ago, we worked on regulations to expand the definition of awaiting foster care placement. Now, I know that's sort of out of the McKinney-Vento world post-ESSA, but certainly it was an important opportunity and a good example of the way in which we were able to engage with our state agency as well as our state attorney general to craft regulations in a way that sort of helped families most effectively. Next slide, please. And then a final tool that I'll share is litigation. And I think when people, well, at least when non-lawyers think about lawyers, this is probably the tool that you think we use most frequently, whatever we're doing. And I would say that with respect to the PJC's work in homeless students education, it's probably the tool we use least frequently, but it's an important one nonetheless. And when we do see systemic ongoing problems in school systems that are really keeping homeless kids out or preventing them from staying stable or preventing them from really even having an opportunity to succeed, our first step is always to engage with the school system, see if we can collaboratively develop solutions. But if that does not work, if that doesn't get us anywhere, then litigation certainly is a tool, and we have brought lawsuits before, and our goal is always just to improve policies and practices. And our experience, I think, pretty much each time has been that once a lawsuit is filed, it's often a way that just gets everyone to the table to sit down, roll up our sleeves and get to work on how we can fix things. So when we have had litigation, for the most part, we've ended up with a settlement that's called for changes to policies and practices. And what we've seen is that a number of the changes that result from the lawsuits, whether it's increased training or streamlining enrollment processes or doing outreach and awareness raising activities, or adequately staffing a homeless education liaison position, those reforms oftentimes have very measurable impacts on homeless students. In a matter of a relatively short period, a couple of years even, we've gone back and done evaluations and seen improvements in school stability, so fewer school changes for homeless students, increases in identification, so larger numbers of the homeless students identified, not necessarily always because of a growth in homelessness, but because the school is actually able to pick up on kids that it was missing before. And then, even improvements in test scores, graduation rates, and grade promotion rates. So very measurable impacts that school systems themselves want to achieve can be the result of some of these reforms. Slide. So thank you for allowing me to share that. I'm going to turn it over to Michael.
All right, thanks, Monisha. I know we only have a few minutes left, but we still have one speaker to go. Last but not least, I'm going to turn over to Maura McInerney from Education Law Center. But before I do so, I just want to do the time check, and we're probably going to run out of time for FAQs, but we are receiving questions, so please submit those questions, and if we don't get to them after Maura's presentation, we will get back to you after this webinar. So thank you. Go ahead, Maura.
Thanks very much, Michael. Really appreciate this opportunity. Could you change the slide? Thanks. So I just wanted to mention who we are. We're a statewide advocacy organization, law firm in Pennsylvania. We represent educationally at-risk children, so children who are living in poverty, children of color, English language learners, children with disabilities, etc., including children in foster care and those experiencing homelessness. We work in 3 strategic areas to ensure equal access to quality schools, to provide adequate and equitable school funding across the Commonwealth, and also address dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline. Next slide. I also wanted to mention that Education Law Center is part of the Legal Center for Foster Care and Education. Michael had asked me to talk about the new ESSA provisions relating to children in foster care, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but also highlight some of the important substantive changes in ESSA that really can inform state and local guidance. So I wanted to mention, I'm sorry, can you go back a slide? Thanks. So this is the Legal Center for Foster Care and Education. If you go to the website, fostercareandeducation.org, we have a searchable database where you can look at model state laws as well as some local policies relating to school stability for children in foster care. We recently released the ESSA Implementation Toolkit, which essentially provides a lot of guidance with regard to how you can fund transportation, seek reimbursement between child welfare and school districts, and it provides a lot of useful examples that we highlight. We also have something called the Blueprint for Change, which highlights how to improve educational outcomes for children in foster care, and again provides state and local examples. Thanks. Next slide. So just to take a step back, I know there are a lot of folks that are from local education agencies on the phone, and everyone knows that this is that ESSA is a huge revision to ESSA. And just to remember that this is really an opportunity to change a lot of things at the local level, because ESSA shifts responsibility from the federal level to the state level and then to the local level with respect to establishing standards and assessments, but particularly it drives interventions for at-risk students and highlights important changes obviously for children in foster care, children experiencing homelessness, but also includes new provisions about children in the juvenile justice system, English language learners, and students with disabilities. Next slide. So we utilize a number of advocacy strategies, and I know everybody has sort of talked about this already, but we work at the state level with respect to both legislation as well as policy advocacy. So for example, in ESSA implementation, a lot of states have formed stakeholder groups to say what should the state plan look like. Pennsylvania had such a group that it got together to get recommendations and look at all of the areas of ESSA planning, and we participated in that work group. So that's the first area that I wanted to highlight, that it's important to have some legal advocates who might be able to participate in that process. We also have state work groups regarding each of the student cohorts, so children in foster care, children experiencing homelessness, English language learners. At the local policy level, there's a lot of things that need to be changed to reflect the new provisions of ESSA relating to children experiencing homelessness and children in foster care. So to revisit sort of what your local enrollment policy are and make sure that you've ensured immediate enrollment for both children experiencing homelessness, children in foster care, as well as to talk about what the protocol will be with respect to ensuring school stability. Put timelines on it. How long will it take? Who will pay and arrange for transportation in the beginning? Do you shift responsibility from child welfare to the school district or vice versa? To really look at those local policies, and then to look at all the changes in ESSA relating to children experiencing homelessness, to reference extracurricular activities, to talk about ensuring school stability for children who are in preschool, all of those issues. At the legislative level, we have introduced school stability legislation in Pennsylvania. I know that prior to ESSA's changes relating to kids in foster care, a lot of states, approximately 30 states, had adopted legislation to ensure school stability because it was something that was part of the responsibility of the child welfare agencies beginning in 2008 to ensure school stability. But for many states, it's a real sea change to say that we are now ensuring school stability for every child in foster care. So in our state, we look to make changes actually to our Juvenile Act, our Human Services Code, or Child Welfare Code, in addition to our Pennsylvania School Code. Obviously, another advocacy strategy we use is litigation, and our particular office has undertaken cases on behalf of children experiencing homelessness under McKinney-Vento, which has resulted in really useful changes at the state level with regard to identifying who needs to be served, et cetera. Next slide. So just to remind everyone what the law says with regard to children who are in foster care, Title I plans must describe how state education agencies will collaborate with state child welfare agencies to ensure school stability for all children. So the insurer duty is really at the state level. The state education agency must ensure that this is happening across the board. So they must ensure that LEAs are providing school stability and identify a state-level point of contact. So states have had to do that by December 10th, and that's currently been done in states to ensure that you do have in your Department of Education some state-level point of contact for children in foster care. And in addition, to ensure that LEAs designate a point of contact that only applies if your child welfare agency designates points of contact. For example, in Pennsylvania, we have 67 county children and youth agencies. Each one has an education liaison. So now all of our 700 school districts had to identify someone who would be the point of contact for children in foster care. At the state level, it cannot be your McKinney-Vento coordinator, which makes a lot of sense because they're overloaded trying to address those issues. At the local level, it can be someone who is your McKinney-Vento liaison. In Pennsylvania, our infrastructure is that we not only have a state coordinator, we also have regional coordinators. So we're split up into regions, 8 regions, and each of those regions has now not only a McKinney-Vento regional coordinator, but also a foster care regional coordinator. Next slide. So as everyone probably on this call knows, the deadline was December 10th of 2016 for local education agencies to develop and implement plans for the transportation of foster youth to their school of origin. At the Legal Center, we sort of keep tabs on where states are and what they're doing with respect to this issue and ensuring school stability. So we have a lot of models that you can look at on our website. So that Title I plan has to essentially provide an assurance that the LEA has developed and implemented this written procedure. So you have to explain how transportation will be provided, arranged, and funded for the duration of the time that a child is in foster care, ensure that they're receiving it promptly in a cost-effective manner, which it talks about, and address how additional costs of transportation will be funded and shared by agreement between the education agency and child welfare or under state law. And as I mentioned, some states already have laws that delineate who pays for transportation and how that's going to occur. But in many states, we now have local transportation plans that will delineate who will pay for transportation and how those costs will be shared. And you also have to ensure that children are receiving a transportation during dependency of a dispute. There was a federal regulation that is still on the books but is currently on hold under the Congressional Review Act with respect to dispute resolution process, but in most cases, many states have already adopted some kind of dispute resolution process. So as we see this playing out in the state of Pennsylvania, in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, we have a lot of different local level transportation plans. If anyone wants to see those model plans, I'm happy to share those with you. But I really wanted to highlight what our state did in order to ensure compliance. Those local transportation plans were due by January 31st in Pennsylvania, and I know that some states have sort of changed that deadline, but I think it's imperative that things be set up before the next school year so it's clear that all children in foster care will receive that transportation promptly. Also wanted to highlight child welfare agencies can draw down Title IV-E administrative dollars and maintenance dollars to support school stability, but it's important to recognize that many children are not 4E eligible, so that is something I know folks have worked into their local transportation plans. If they're not 4E eligible, in some cases the school district has agreed they will pay in those instances or that they will share costs. Next slide. So it's important, awaiting foster care placement has gone away, right? It was deleted from the definition because we now have this new protection for children in foster care. There are a few states where the phrase will be deleted in 2 years, but that's important to recognize that there needs to be a smooth transition for those students who were previously McKinney-Vento eligible and now may fall under the ESSA provisions regarding children in foster care. But remember that the law still applies, that if they were eligible in the beginning of the year, they are entitled to transportation provided till the end of the year. Or you may transition it to a different funding stream. So I see it playing out in both ways. In addition, some children in foster care will qualify as homeless for other reasons, if they're living in shelters, etc. Next slide. So this is sort of state guidance was issued on this, and it addressed the issue that there will be court orders involved with regard to children in foster care. Talked about best interest determinations being made collaboratively between the Child Welfare Agency and the LEA. It provided a best interest form with respect to transportation and emphasized the importance of ensuring school stability before the transportation plans were due to PDE. And in each one of those cases, in addition to designating a point of contact that had a contact which had to be provided to the state, all of the transportation plans also needed to be provided to the state. So they're actually collecting all of those local transportation plans, which really ensures compliance across the board. Next slide. So the state guidance, if you want to go look at what some of the tools are in terms of model transportation plans, and they basically provide the templates for each one of these. So if you go to pafostercare.org, you will see those. Next slide. So those are the transportation agreement, MOU, local transportation plan template. So those might be useful to look at. With regard to the dispute resolution process, in addition to having the local plan sort of address that issue, Pennsylvania also has an infrastructure where they have the regional coordinators and the state coordinator to ensure that disputes will be resolved promptly. Next slide. So I wanted to mention two things with regard to McKinney-Vento. One is to ensure that you have cross-reference guidance regarding children in foster care. I think that sometimes that's important to do at the state level. And then to highlight a lot of the revisions that have been made to ESSA concerning children experiencing homelessness. So to reflect school stability for children in preschool, that should also be reflected in guidance regarding children in preschool that is often a different division. For example, in Pennsylvania, we have a separate office that deals with children in preschool, so their guidance should also reference this point with regard to feeder schools, providing transportation to the end of the academic year, what it means to provide a form that's understandable to parents, the right to pendency until full and final resolution of a dispute and all available appeals. I know that in our case in Pennsylvania, they have already issued the revised guidance under ESSA that reflects these new provisions. Reflect the privacy protections, delineate duties of state and local McKinney-Vento coordinators, and really talk importantly about those school success provisions for older youth, unaccompanied homeless youth, which are really important. Next slide. So then at the local level, if you're reviewing your policies, to look at how are you going to address school stability for children in preschool. I know it's an issue we're working with the School District of Philadelphia on right now. Ensure that you have informed families that they are entitled to transportation till the end of the school year when they become permanently, even if they become permanently housed during the school year. Talk about what are the duties of the McKinney-Vento liaison at the school district level. Ensure access to special education, early intervention services. All of this is coming out of the changes to ESSA. And then on school success, to talk about full and partial credits, to have a protocol to ensure that you're looking at that issue, to look at school discipline, that homelessness will be considered as a factor, as ESSA states. Individualized college counseling, how will you effectuate that? Liaisons must ensure unaccompanied youth are informed of their status with regard to being independent students and obtain verification of that status, which is critically important. That comes up time and time again. I know that we've been asked to fill out those forms, and that's something that the McKinney-Vento liaison really needs to complete. So next slide. So just wanted to also highlight data and reporting. This is the first time that you need to provide disaggregated data with regard to both children who are experiencing homelessness and those in foster care, that those can be in your state report card. Those should be readily available at the local level as well as at the state level. Then that's student achievement, looking at standardized test scores, looking at high school graduation rates, which is another issue that was addressed in the regulations, which are now on hold. Looking at performance on other academic indicators. So all of that is being decided at your state level, but to also really look at that information and look at how can we improve educational outcomes for these exceptionally vulnerable student cohorts. Next slide. That's it.
All right, thanks, Maura. I know we are going over time, but I do appreciate people staying online. I just have a few questions to ask the group before we end the webinar. So if you can go ahead and answer the question on your screen. And the question is, did this webinar improve your knowledge of ESSA implementation? All right, so I'll give it a couple more seconds before I close the poll, and then we'll go ahead with the next question, and then I'll have everyone's contact information in the last slide. Okay, and then the last question is, will you use what you learned today in your work or advocacy? So you're going to see another poll launch, so go ahead and answer that. I'll give you a couple of seconds to fill that out. All right, I'll give it 5 more seconds before I close the poll, so go ahead and fill out if you haven't done so. Okay, so I know we ran out of time for Q&A, but please go ahead and send those questions. On your screen is all of our contact information. I know we sent a lot of information to you guys. Hopefully, this webinar gave you a flavor of what issues some states face in implementing and enforcing changes under Every Student Succeeds Act, and obviously the importance of engaging legal advocates. So if you have any follow-up questions, we're happy to answer those. Just send those to us by email, and we hope to see you with our next webinar. Thank you, everyone.